The Enigma of Pythagoras. When we hear the name Pythagoras, most of us recall a school theorem and a geometric right triangle. But behind this simple equation lies a far more mysterious and profound history. In this video, we will journey in the footsteps of one of antiquity's most enigmatic philosophers, a man who claimed numbers were the foundation of the world, heard the music of the spheres, and founded a community living by strict laws of harmony and inner purification. You will learn how Pythagoras' teachings blended mathematics and mysticism, why his disciples took vows of silence, and how their school became embroiled in political conflict. We will uncover the secrets of the Pythagorean life, the legendary death of the master, and how, centuries later, his name became a symbol of wisdom, inspiring Plato, astronomers, alchemists, and even modern scientists.
Samos, the beginning. The island of Samos, surrounded by the Aegean Sea with its vineyards, temple mosaics, and bustling harbors, was not only a cultural and trade hub of Ionia, but also a crossroads for merchants, sailors, artisans, and philosophers. It was here, in 570 BC, in the city that gave the island its name, that a boy was born. His name would soon be spoken with respect and later with reverence. Pythagoras. Details of his origins are fragmentary, woven from later sources that often blur with legend. His father, Mnesarchus, was said to be a stonecutter and engraver, possibly also a merchant who traded in other cities. Some sources claim he came from the Phoenician city of Tyre, famed for its craftsmen and merchants. But it's more likely he was an Ionian, like his wife, Pythaeus, who was from Samos. Pythagoras was believed to have inherited not only his intellect, but also his piety from his mother. Legend says that before his birth, she visited the Oracle of Delphi, where a priestess prophesied that her son would be a man who could understand not only men, but also the gods. From childhood, Pythagoras displayed a tendency for observation, calmness, and silent concentration. He could sit for hours on the shore, watching the rhythm of the waves, as if trying to discern the hidden order within their motion. He was not a child who played loudly with others in the city square, but one who stood slightly apart, observing, as if searching for patterns. His father, noticing his son's unusual thirst for knowledge, hired the best teachers available on Samos. Pythagoras studied writing, arithmetic, music, and the basics of geometry. A key mentor was Hermodamus, a philosopher connected to the Orphic tradition, which emphasized moral purification and the soul as an immortal essence. This teacher didn't just impart knowledge, but instilled inner discipline, silence, moderation, and the pursuit of harmony in all things. From an early age, Pythagoras followed a strict routine, rising before dawn, purification, silent contemplation, recording his thoughts, and observing nature. This was not merely a habit, but part of an upbringing where purity of soul and order in action were paramount. He would later claim that all things ordered are beautiful. Music held a special place in his life. He noticed early on that strings of different lengths produced sounds of different pitches, which became his first step toward understanding the link between number and harmony. A later anecdote tells of him hearing blacksmiths striking anvils of different weights. Noticing the sounds related to each other in specific proportions, he began experimenting with stream tension, observations that would later form his theory of musical intervals. His family home was not wealthy, but was filled with respect for knowledge. His father, traveling to Miletus and Ephesus, would bring back scrolls, tools, and artifacts to broaden his son's horizons. Once he brought a wooden model of a boat, and Pythagoras, examining it, measured the ratios between its parts, trying to understand how simple elements created a stable form. But more important than any object were conversations. The young Pythagoras loved questions. He queried teachers and elders not to argue, but to hear explanations and understand the logic. He never accepted simple answers, always searching for the foundational theme, which would become central to his philosophy. Samos, in that era, was a politically active community, but like other Greek city-states, political turmoil and strife often hindered spiritual development. Around the time Pythagoras was coming of age, the tyrant Polycrates rose to power, an energetic but harsh ruler known for his love of luxury, grand construction projects, and displays of force. Although Polycrates patronized some arts, the atmosphere of control likely stifled those seeking intellectual freedom. This may have fueled Pythagoras's desire to leave, not out of fear, but from a need to find a deeper truth. There are accounts that by the age of 20, Pythagoras was considering departure. Legend says he met a wandering sage from the east on Samos, who spoke of the knowledge of Egyptian priests. The temples of Memphis and Thebes, where generations of keepers had written, measured, observed, and contemplated for centuries. This meeting is said to have deeply impressed the young Pythagoras. He realized that to understand the world's order, one must not just observe nature, but learn from those who had studied it for ages, guarding knowledge as sacred. From that moment, the idea of a journey took root. He began to withdraw more often, spending increasing time in reading and contemplation, preparing not just for travel, but for a transformation of his views, habits, and even language. Before he would leave Samos for distant lands, his youth there had finally shaped him into a man seeking not fame, power, or wealth, but the order of that which is eternal and unchanging, like the rhythm of the waves on a rocky shore. Pythagoras was about 22 years old when he left Samos.
Disciple of the world, Egypt, Babylon, and Eastern wisdom. He was no longer an adolescent, but not yet an elder sage, a man in whom youthful receptivity blended with early inner maturity. He was not attracted to a political career, wealth, or military glory, common ambitions for Greek youth. His path was toward truth, a truth not limited to words and conclusions, but one that permeates the very order of things. For this, he set out for Egypt, where, according to legend, the most ancient and secret knowledge was kept. The journey was arduous. He left Ionia, crossed the coast of Asia Minor, visited Miletus, and from there sailed via Rhodes and Cyprus to the eastern Mediterranean, finally reaching the mouth of the Nile. Along the way, he likely conversed with Milesian philosophers, possibly including Anaximander, one of the first Greeks to ponder the infinite as the source of all things. Though there is no direct evidence of this meeting, ancient authors mention that Pythagoras was interested in the Ionian views, but felt truth required deeper immersion and personal experience. Arriving in Egypt, he entered a civilization millennia older, where everything, from the shape of columns to temple halls, was governed by principles of symmetry, number, ritual, and measure. Egyptian priests, who held both religious and scientific authority, were wary of foreigners. To be admitted to their circle, Pythagoras needed not only knowledge of Greek language and customs, but also perseverance, discipline, and above all, humility. Later sources claim he had a letter of recommendation from the Samian ruler Polycrates to the Egyptian pharaoh Amasis II. This king, though traditional, was relatively open to Greek influence and maintained ties with Ionian cities. Reportedly, Pythagoras managed to gain the trust of the priests in Memphis and possibly Heliopolis, one of the oldest centers of Egyptian religion and astronomy. There, in temple schools, he studied mathematics, geometry, ritual practices, calendar calculations, astronomical observations, and the symbolism underlying Egyptian temple architecture.
He learned the laws behind stellar clocks, studied civil and lunisolar calendars, and observed how Egyptians measured and divided land after the annual Nile floods. He realized these operations concealed not just practicality, but a deeply rooted understanding of a numerical order connecting earth, sky, and human affairs. According to Diogenes Laertius, Pythagoras spent 22 years in Egypt. Though the accuracy is debated, most scholars agree his stay was prolonged. He was not a student in the modern sense, but a participant in rites, an observer of temple processes, and a patient researcher absorbing knowledge through practice and contemplation. However, his time in Egypt could not last forever. The country was invaded by the Persian king Cambyses II. Egypt fell. Pharaoh Psamtik III was captured, and the land came under control of the Achaemenid Empire. One version, from late antique sources, claims Pythagoras, like other Greeks in Egypt, was captured by the Persians and taken to Babylon, the capital of their empire. Though evidence for this episode is limited, the transition from Egypt to Mesopotamia is reflected in Neo-Pythagorean and Roman literature. Babylon, whether he arrived voluntarily or as a captive, became his second great center of learning. Unlike Egypt, where knowledge was shrouded in ritual, the Babylonian tradition was distinguished by extreme precision and systematization. The Chaldean priests, keepers of archives with tables of stellar movements, lunar phases, eclipses, and solar cycles, possessed knowledge accumulated over centuries. Pythagoras likely familiarized himself with the base 60 numeral system, the division of the circle into 360 degrees, and methods for calculating celestial trajectories, all forming the basis of his future thoughts on cosmic harmony. One story tells of him witnessing a ritual observing the evening rise of Venus and being amazed that calculations made beforehand predicted its appearance exactly. This precision, derived not from guesswork but from consistent mathematical observation, left a deep mark on him. Beyond astronomy and arithmetic, he may have also encountered ideas from Persian ethics, particularly Zoroastrianism, which emphasized spiritual purification, the moral struggle between good and evil, and the human soul as a participant in a cosmic choice. Though Pythagoras did not become a follower of these religions, he carried their echoes in his pursuit of purity, his belief in the soul's immortality and transmigration, and his view of numerical order as a reflection of divine law. When he left Babylon and headed back to the Greek world, he was no longer the same man. His path now was to synthesize what the Greeks considered incompatible: the wisdom of the East, the practice of Egypt, the observations of Babylon, and the philosophical insight of Ionia. He had become a bearer of synthetic knowledge, not superficial, but hard-won, tested by time and personal effort. He did not yet know where he would find a home for his ideas, but he knew one thing for certain: his return to Samos would only be a transition to something new.
Return to Samos and inner disappointment. When Pythagoras set foot on Samos again, he was returning not just home, but to the place where his spiritual formation had begun. Years filled with study, observation, and inner growth had passed since his departure. He returned not as a youth seeking truth, but as a man who had touched the wisdom of the most ancient civilizations and realized that knowledge requires not only accumulation, but also transmission. With this intention, to share, explain, and guide, he stepped onto familiar ground, hoping Samos would be fertile soil for his ideas. But Samos had changed. Not just outwardly, its streets were louder, its harbors more bustling, but in spirit. The island was under the rule of the tyrant Polycrates, a willful, powerful, and calculating man whose reign brought prosperity but allowed no dissent. Polycrates fortified the city, strengthened the fleet, and erected massive engineering projects, including the famous tunnel of Eupalinos, aiming to make Samos a naval power. However, his state had no room for independent schools or reclusive philosophers whose influence extended beyond speeches in the agora. Pythagoras, shunning political passions, did not seek confrontation. He settled quietly and began holding discussions with interested young men, sharing his views on the nature of numbers, the soul, the world's order, and the importance of inner discipline. Word of the unusual man returned from Egypt and Babylon spread quickly. His speech was measured, his thoughts unconventional yet intriguing. He spoke not of gods like the poets, nor of sophistry, but of the order inherent in being, the numbers underlying all existence, and the soul temporarily connected to the body. With this intention to share, explain, and guide, he stepped onto familiar ground, hoping Samos would be fertile soil for his ideas. But Samos had changed, not just outwardly. Its streets were louder, its harbors more bustling, but in spirit. The island was under the rule of the tyrant Polycrates, a willful, powerful, and calculating man whose reign brought prosperity but allowed no dissent. Polycrates fortified the city, strengthened the fleet, and erected massive engineering projects, including the famous tunnel of Eupalinos, aiming to make Samos a naval power. However, his state had no room for independent schools or reclusive philosophers whose influence extended beyond speeches in the agora. Pythagoras, shunning political passions, did not seek confrontation. He settled quietly and began holding discussions with interested young men, sharing his views on the nature of numbers, the soul, the world's order, and the importance of inner discipline. Word of the unusual man returned from Egypt and Babylon spread quickly. His speech was measured, his thoughts unconventional yet intriguing. He spoke not of gods like the poets, nor of sophistry, but of the order inherent in being, the numbers underlying all existence, and the soul temporarily connected to the body. Gradually, a small group of listeners gathered around him. Youths eager for knowledge, including sons of wealthy citizens who had the leisure for philosophy. He taught them in private settings, perhaps in a house provided by a patron or in the shade of trees on the city's outskirts. These sessions were not a formal school, but had a clear structure and routine. He accustomed his pupils to silence, abstinence, precise observation, and gradual immersion in abstract thought. Numbers held a special place in these studies, not as symbols for counting, but as principles of the world's structure. But this could not last long. Under a tyranny, any organized gathering, even apolitical, aroused suspicion. Authorities were especially wary of youths involved in unauthorized meetings involving youths from noble families. Rumors spread that Pythagoras taught something secret, proposing a way of life that questioned the polis's ordinary customs. His talks on the soul's immortality, purification, transmigration, and karmic consequences were perceived as alien. In a society where tradition and order were defined by power, a philosopher operating in categories of eternity could seem dangerous. There is evidence that he was advised to stop the meetings. Perhaps some elders urged him not to excite young minds. Others quietly stopped sending their sons.
Though there was no direct persecution, the atmosphere changed. Pythagoras felt the soil on which he wanted to plant the seeds of knowledge was not only dry, but suspicious. He tried another path. Legend says he withdrew from the city to the eastern part of the island, to Mount Kirkis, and founded a secluded place for meditation and teaching. He likely hoped that away from urban rumors and power, his disciples could study in peace. But even there, he couldn't create a stable community. People left, sessions were interrupted, and silence gave way to anxiety. Some who abandoned the philosopher began to distort what they had heard, intentionally or not, spawning new speculations about his teachings. Pythagoras understood he was not destined to build what he envisioned on Samos. The tyrant's rule didn't allow for free growth, and public opinion was prone to reject anything beyond the familiar. His philosophy needed a different environment, among people capable of voluntary discipline, in a setting that respected silence and listening, not just debate and victory. It craved inner quiet and a striving to transform life, not just talk about virtue. Without conflict or accusation, he decided to leave the island. His choice fell to the west, toward the great Greek colonies of southern Italy, Magna Graecia, known not only for their wealth and ties to mainland Greece, but also for the relative freedom afforded to scholars, philosophers, and travelers. There, he hoped, he could not only speak, but also build. There, he might find a city ready to listen, understand, and accept something new.
Croton, a new home for ideas. When Pythagoras arrived in Croton, a wealthy and influential city on the coast of southern Italy, he left behind years of study, wanderings, and failed attempts to establish himself on his native island. This path, through Egypt, Babylonia, and the unsuccessful return to Ionia, was ending in a place that was to become not only his new home, but the space where his ideas would take the form of a community and a legacy. Croton was one of the most developed cities of Magna Graecia, where Greek colonies thrived in broader and freer conditions than the metropolis. Its inhabitants were known for their energy, competitive spirit, and desire for public order. The city was famous for its physicians, athletes, and philosophers, and its citizens already held respect for those who possessed knowledge and could lead by example. According to tradition, shortly after his arrival, Pythagoras was invited to speak before the Council of Elders, Gerousia, about the state of the city's morals. He did not use harsh language, did not condemn or flatter. He spoke of harmony, moderation, and the need for accord between the soul and one's actions. His speech, later biographers recounted, made a strong impression. He was invited to stay, and soon he began teaching, first young men, then mature men, and later even women, a rare phenomenon in the Greek world. It was in Croton that Pythagoras founded what would later be called the Pythagorean school, though its structure was unlike anything we understand by the word school today. It was not an academy in the Athenian sense, not merely an interest group, nor a sectarian brotherhood. It was a philosophical community that was simultaneously religious, scientific, and ethical, where lifestyle, thought, and worldview formed a unified whole. To be accepted into the circle of disciples, one had to pass a probation period. For the first year, sometimes longer, a newcomer had no right to ask questions, let alone argue. They had to listen. This period was called akousmetikoi, hearers. Disciples gathered for lessons and absorbed the teaching in silence.
Only after prolonged observation of their behavior, lifestyle, restraint, and capacity for inner development was a novice allowed to transition to a deeper stage, to become a mathematikoi, learner, one who studies the essence of things through reason and numbers. The curriculum included arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, the so-called quadrivium, which would later become the foundation of education in medieval Europe. But for the Pythagoreans, these were not just scientific disciplines. Each reflected an aspect of the world order. Arithmetic helped comprehend the essence of numbers. Geometry, the structure of forms. Music, the laws of harmony. And astronomy, the order of celestial motion. Studying these areas was meant to lead to an understanding of the universe's unity and wholeness. Yet Pythagoras' philosophy was not limited to doctrine. The school's members led a strictly ordered life. They rose at dawn, began the day with silent contemplation and exercises, followed by studies, then simple vegetarian food, physical labor, and reflection. Each evening ended with self-observation. Each member had to ask themselves 3 questions in solitude. What did I do today? What did I do right? What did I do wrong? This was a practice of internal, not external law. There were also more concrete rules. The community forbade eating beans, likely for ritual or dietary reasons. It was not permitted to break silence unnecessarily, take things without permission, laugh without cause, or even place shoes at the head of the bed. These prohibitions were not seen as absurd restrictions, but as discipline aimed at curbing chaotic desires. The absence of private property was particularly significant. Everything a member owned became common property. Among friends, all is common, the Pythagoreans said. This applied not only to things, but to knowledge. The teaching could not be transmitted to those who had not been initiated, and many formulas, doctrines, and treatises remained oral, unwritten. Everything important was stored in memory, passed on through personal mentorship, and kept within the circle. According to some sources, Pythagoras taught behind a curtain. His voice was heard, but he remained invisible to his disciples for a long time. This was done so that newcomers would focus not on the teacher's personality, but on the content of his words. Only after several years of discipleship did one earn the right to see and speak with him. Even then, Pythagoras' authority remained absolute, and his word was taken as the standard. Among his inner circle were not only philosophers, but also warriors, physicians, and lawmakers. Milo of Croton, the famous Olympic wrestling champion, was not just a patron, but a follower of the school. Thanks to such figures, Pythagorean ideas began to permeate the city's political life. He did not seek power himself, but his disciples participated in discussing laws, proposing reforms, working with youth, and teaching ethics through numbers and order. Over time, a strong community formed around Pythagoras, expanding far beyond Croton. Disciples traveled to other cities, founded new circles, and brought Pythagorean principles to new lands. Yet in Croton itself, his school remained the center. It wasn't called an academy or a temple, but everyone who entered felt they were crossing a boundary between the everyday and the eternal. Pythagoras saw his work not merely as teaching, but the transformation of man. He asserted that one must live by number, by rhythm, by law, not by whim or passion. He sought to create not only a system of knowledge, but a form of life where reason rules, feelings are subdued, and the soul is gradually purified and ascends to a higher order.
The secrets of numbers and the music of the spheres. Once firmly established in Croton with a circle of disciples, Pythagoras began to reveal not just individual truths, but a system based on the idea of number as the universal principle of all things. He did not present numbers as a conventional counting tool. Rather, he considered them the primordial foundation underlying not only mathematics, but also nature, music, the cosmos, the human soul, and even justice. Pythagoras claimed that all is number. By this, he meant not a trivial reduction of everything to arithmetic, but a profound philosophical assertion. Number is measure, order, ratio. The world we live in his view, is not chaotic but lawfully structured, and this lawfulness is numerical. Through number, the structure of being manifests itself, and whoever can read the structure can understand nature's design, the order of the stars, and the moral law. One of the most famous stories from antiquity tells of Pythagoras passing by a blacksmith shop and hearing the sounds of hammers striking anvils, differing in pitch. He noticed that the differences in tone corresponded to the masses of the hammers used. Later, he experimented with strings, stretching them on identical frames with different lengths and tensions, and discovered that musical intervals obey simple numerical ratios: 2:1 for the octave, 3:2 for the fifth, 4:3 for the fourth. Thus was born the doctrine of harmony as numerical relation. On this basis, Pythagoras formulated the idea of the music of the spheres, the concept that the planets and stars, moving in their orbits, create a harmony akin to music, though inaudible to our ears. Each celestial body emitted its own sound, determined by its speed and distance. Together, these movements formed a perfect concord, a cosmic symphony. He did not claim this was an audible melody, but rather that it was comprehended by reason and inner sensation. A person living in harmony with themselves and the world enters into an invisible resonance with this order. The central symbol of the school was the tetractys, a triangular figure of 10 points, 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4. The sum of these numbers is 10, the perfect, complete number. In the tetractys, Pythagoras saw not just an arithmetic construction, but a universal model of the world. 1 signified the beginning, monad; 2, the emergence of difference, dyad; 3, movement and harmony, triad; and 4, completion and stability, tetrad. Disciples began each day with a mental invocation of the tetractys as an image of order and perfection. In Pythagorean philosophy, each number had symbolic meaning. 1, monad, unity, the divine origin; 2, dyad, duality, division, contradiction; 3, triad, harmony, resolution of opposites; 4, tetrad, wholeness, the 4 elements, material fullness; 5, pentad, union, 2 plus 3, female plus male; 6, hexad, balance, perfection; 7, heptad, rhythm, becoming, the virgin number; 8, ogdoad; 9, ennead, completion of a cycle; 10, decade, perfection, return to unity. Pythagoras and his disciples classified numbers as even, female, passive, fluid, and odd, male, active, stable. Their interaction formed the basis not only of abstract philosophy, but also of practical judgments about the structure of the family, city, or the nature of the soul. Studying numbers, the Pythagoreans discovered their spatial forms. They worked with figurate numbers, triangular, square, pentagonal, which could be expressed as dots forming geometric shapes. These constructions were not drafting exercises, but reflected a deep-seated belief that numbers not only generate sounds, but also figures, proportions, and structures. Thus, mathematics became not an abstraction, but a visible expression of the cosmos. From this thinking emerged geometry, not as a measurement technique, but as a philosophy of forms. The point was the beginning, the line, connection, the surface, becoming, the volume, completed essence. Students in the school drew, calculated, and found patterns, all accompanied by the awareness that each action was an approach to understanding the world's design. From such studies came the formulation of theorems, and though the famous Pythagorean theorem was likely known earlier in Babylon, it was the Pythagorean school that gave it fundamental significance within a system of thought. Music, also taught in the school, was not studied for inspiration or comfort, but as a mathematical discipline. Students were taught to construct intervals and compose melodies not by inspiration, but according to numerical proportions. Harmony in music was seen as a direct reflection of harmony in the soul and the world. One later story claims Pythagoras could calm an irate disciple simply by playing a specific sequence of sounds. Thus, music built on correct numbers influenced inner states. All of Pythagoras' teaching strove to show that number is not only a universal language, but a path to perfection. It allows one to find law, express order, and cultivate character. Through number, one comprehends measure. Through number, one realizes boundaries and connections. Through number, one arrives at what Pythagoras called catharsis, purification. And so, as he told his disciples, the knowledge of number is not just a science, but a virtue. Not only a path to knowledge, but a path to the soul. But for number to truly become the basis of life, it had to be embodied not only in diagrams and formulas, but in everyday actions, in eating, sleeping, speech, silence, gaze, and movement.
Enemy of the state, conflict and persecution. In its first years, the Pythagorean school in Croton was met with curiosity and respect. Its members behaved with restraint, did not interfere in politics, engaged in no agitation, and sought no power. They were distinguished by their moderation, modesty, concentration, and a certain detachment. They remained silent when others argued, drank no wine excessively, took no part in riotous festivities and competitions, and tried to maintain a daily routine following an inner rhythm nobody outside the school understood. This behavior initially inspired respect, but gradually began to breed distrust. The problem was that the Pythagoreans weren't just studying numbers. They were cultivating a way of life. And this lifestyle, based on self-restraint, discipline, and inner law, began to permeate society. Many disciples came from noble and wealthy families, were educated and influential, and some eventually assumed important positions in the governments of Magna Graecia cities. They advocated for political equilibrium, justice, and moderation, and spoke against demagoguery, arbitrary rule, and hasty decisions. This irritated those who held different, more rigid, authoritarian, and aggressive views. Particular alarm was caused by the Pythagoreans' seeming over-organization. Their cohesion, rituals, silence, and behavioral consistency were perceived as signs of a secret conspiracy. Some began to say the school was not a philosophical community, but a closed corporation seeking political control. Others claimed they had their own religion, rites, and laws that contradicted those of the city. Suspicions arose that within the community, not only philosophical ideas were discussed, but also methods of political influence. These suspicions were intensified by Pythagoras' acceptance of women into the school. In the ancient Greek world, especially in the conservative polis of Magna Graecia, women's participation in intellectual life was seen as unusual and for many undesirable. Pythagoras, however, believed the soul had no gender, and that women, possessing the same capacity for reason and virtue as men, were capable of philosophy and self-knowledge. Women learning within a male brotherhood was in itself a challenge to tradition, provoking shock in some and outrage in others. Against this backdrop of tension, a man named Cylon played a pivotal role. He was a wealthy and influential Crotoniite hungry for fame and recognition. After allegedly being rejected from the Pythagorean community, possibly due to his temper, lack of restraint, or pride, he became one of its most active enemies. His speeches, full of personal grievance and political accusation, spread quickly among the citizens. He claimed Pythagoras sought power, that his disciples formed a closed aristocratic clique, and that their teachings undermined the city's traditions. At first, these accusations seemed exaggerated, but as the school's numbers and influence grew, the situation changed. Pythagoreans indeed held important posts in the council, the judicial system, and military command. Though they did not seize power, their lifestyle and political philosophy clashed with the interests of a faction of the nobility inclined toward more authoritarian methods. Cylon exploited this discontent to turn public anxiety into direct accusation. The atmosphere intensified. According to tradition, in a neighboring city, a mob stormed a house where Pythagoreans were gathered. The house was set on fire, and almost everyone inside perished. This attack marked the first instance of physical violence against the school. Though details are scarce, most ancient authors agree this was the beginning of true persecution. Pythagorean homes came under attack in other cities. In Croton, opposition to the school became open. Public accusations began, organized assemblies, sharp speeches in the agora. Some Pythagoreans were forced to flee the city. Others tried to remain calm, but tension mounted. Pythagoras, as the founder, was denied the right to speak. He was not given a chance to defend himself. The man recently revered as a teacher was now viewed as a suspicious outsider. Some sources claim Pythagoras tried to settle the conflict. He met with opponents, wrote letters to other cities, and addressed the citizens with explanations, but it was too late. His fame now worked against him. He was not believed. His silence was perceived as contempt, his philosophy as a cover for power. By the mid-crisis, the school had effectively ceased to exist as an organized community. Most disciples were forced to flee. Those who remained went into hiding or scattered to other cities. Authorities began destroying buildings, confiscating property, and obliterating archives. The very idea of the school became undesirable. Even the name of Pythagoras was for a time unspoken. What Pythagoras himself felt at this moment remains a matter of conjecture. He likely experienced not only personal pain at the destruction of his life's work, but also philosophical shock. The order he believed eternal proved vulnerable in the human world. His school did not seek power, yet was perceived as a threat to power. It preached harmony, but provoked enmity. He sought silence, but became the center of an uproar. He witnessed the dissolution of his school. For some time, he remained in Magna Graecia, perhaps in Metapontum or another coastal city, surrounded by a few faithful disciples. His voice was almost never heard in public again. He no longer taught, gathered people, or built new communities. His ideas lived on in the memory of his disciples, in geometry, in music, in ethics. But he himself, as a person, receded into the shadows.
Decline and death, the end of the earthly path. As clouds gathered over the Pythagorean school in the cities of Magna Graecia, which had so recently admired his name, began to turn away, Pythagoras's fate became tragically solitary. The period of the school's flourishing in Croton and other poleis ended in sudden and fierce rejection. The teacher, once surrounded by disciples and respected as a sage, found himself defenseless, under threat of violence, and stripped of the support he had so long built. After a series of attacks on Pythagorean gatherings, Pythagoras was forced to leave Croton.
He went to Metapontum, a city previously well disposed toward him, where he likely hoped to find at least temporary refuge. Metapontum was a polis that revered Apollo and was known for its pursuit of harmony. Among its elite were supporters of Pythagorean ideas of moderation and order. However, upon arriving in Metapontum, Pythagoras no longer sought to create a new school or form a new community. He was deeply shaken by events, physically and spiritually exhausted. According to ancient accounts, he continued to meet with his few remaining disciples, among whom were Theano, possibly his wife or close follower, and others like Maya. These meetings occurred not in lecture halls or under open skies as before, but in private homes, in seclusion, away from prying eyes. Pythagoras likely understood that the era he had created was over. He made no attempts to revive the school in its previous form, nor sought a wide audience. His final conversations were addressed to the few, and in them, it is thought, one heard not so much didactics as contemplation, summation, and inner silence. Perhaps in these months he finally affirmed his conviction that true philosophy does not need wide publicity. It must remain in the hearts of those truly ready to receive it. Ancient authors give different versions of his death. The most probable is that he died in Metapontum of old age, quietly and unnoticed, surrounded by a few devoted disciples, leaving behind no official will, political legacy, or dogmatic codex. Historians estimate he was about 80 years old at the time. However, other sources, especially later ones, tend toward dramatization. Some recount that Pythagoras died in flight. When a group of disciples hid with him in a house outside the city, they were attacked by an anti-Pythagorean mob. The house was set on fire, and to save the others, Pythagoras supposedly sacrificed himself, distracting the attackers. Another legend claims that, fleeing his pursuers, he refused to cross a field of beans, since the prohibition against eating beans was part of the Pythagorean way of life, thus slowing his flight and being caught. Ancient authors often interpreted this version symbolically, as fidelity to principle unto death. Historians lean toward the view that the legends of a dramatic flight and death were inventions of later centuries, likely intended to emphasize the moral purity of the philosopher and his loyalty to his own teachings, even in moments of danger. There is no reliable archaeological or written evidence confirming these dramatic tales. Their existence, however, testifies to the powerful image Pythagoras had already acquired in life and immediately after. In Metapontum in antiquity, there was a Hieron, a shrine where Pythagoras's tomb was believed to be located. According to Cicero, the city revered Pythagoras almost as a divinity and even gave him one of the temples previously dedicated to Apollo. This is not archaeologically confirmed, but the very existence of such a tradition speaks to Pythagoras's high status in the city's posthumous memory. As for his legacy, at the moment of his death it seemed scattered. Many disciples were killed or dispersed, schools destroyed, connections between followers severed. Yet, paradoxically, it was at this moment that a new history began. Despite the school's destruction as an institution, Pythagorean thought did not disappear. Disciples who survived the persecution fled to mainland Greece, especially to Thebes and Athens. There, without loudly calling themselves Pythagoreans, they continued to discuss ideas about number, harmony, the structure of the cosmos, and the link between ethics and mathematical order. Thus ended the earthly path of Pythagoras, not in the glow of a tribune, not in a triumphant finale, but in silence, in obscurity among a few. But that silence into which he departed proved to be merely the prelude to a multi-century echo that his name would generate.
Pythagoras after Pythagoras, philosopher, prophet, symbol. When Pythagoras departed, his second life began, a life in memory, legend, and philosophical systems, where his image became not just a part of the past, but a symbol of universal wisdom. Within decades of his death, philosophers of the Hellenistic world began citing Pythagoras as the founder of a distinct school of thought. Philolaus and Archytas, Known followers of the Pythagorean tradition transmitted the foundations of his teachings, particularly the concept of numbers as the principles of all things. It was through them and through oral tradition that many of Pythagoras' ideas reached Plato. Though Plato himself was not his direct disciple, he shared several principles, from the idea of the world's mathematical structure to the striving for the soul's inner purification through knowledge. In subsequent centuries, the figure of Pythagoras became increasingly legendary. In the 1st century BC in Rome, he was revered by philosophers who saw in him a link between science and spiritual practice. In the early Christian era, his name was mentioned alongside Moses and other ancient sages, and later in the works of Neoplatonists like Porphyry, where he appears not only as a mathematician, but as one who comprehended the universe's hidden laws. In the Middle Ages, the memory of Pythagoras lived on primarily in Arabic science and in the idea of the music of the spheres. He became an esoteric figure, one who heard the cosmos. With the Renaissance, interest in Pythagoras flared up again. Scholars and thinkers regarded him as an ancient herald of truth, whose teachings united philosophy, mysticism, number, and music. He found himself at the center of a dialogue between ancient science and new European thought. In the modern era, Pythagoras came to be seen as a symbol of the mathematical approach to reality. His name became cemented in school textbooks thanks to the Theorem, but his thinking exerted a far deeper influence, from Kepler to Newton's laws, from music to architecture, from philosophy to cosmology. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the image of Pythagoras became a cultural archetype. He was revered by scientists, esotericists, theosophists, and members of secret societies. In some contexts, he was the progenitor of rational science. In others, an initiate into the eternal mysteries of the universe. His name became shrouded in myths, and yet, through the layers of legend and later conjecture, the main point shines through. Pythagoras offered the world a path where knowledge and morality walk hand in hand, where numbers become an expression of harmony.